Adventures in Consciousness by Janeroberts, Chapter 5. Reincarnation hits too close to home. The summer of 1971 went quickly. Monday and Wednesday nights, after supper, I'd do the dishes, take a short walk, and then, around 9, I'd have a Seth session. Seth was finishing his first book, Seth Speaks, The Eternal Validity of the Soul. The last few chapters contain some material dealing with biblical times. Neither of us knew much about the Bible, so Rob spent a good deal of time studying reference books so that his own commentaries in Seth Speaks would be correct. To his surprise, he discovered that biblical authorities differed considerably on the dates of even important events. To my surprise, I discovered that Rob got quite irascible when he was poring over these reference books. At first, I thought little about it. After all, he wanted his notes to be accurate. Gradually, though, I became more and more aware of his increasing irritability. Several times I came upon him muttering to himself as he searched for some date or another. An intense yet subdued fury seemed to drive him. He stood one night really scowling, a book open on his drawing table. His face was white, drawn and angry in the light from the long-armed table lamp. "Hun, you're going to so much trouble," I said. "Do your notes really have to be so detailed? I guess they just don't have definite dates for a lot of these biblical events." "But why don't they?" he demanded. And then he said sharply, "Do you know? When was John the Baptist born?" "How should I know?" I answered, half laughing. "Well, somebody should know. These so-called experts don't know anything." And he turned abruptly back to his notes, ignoring me completely. And puzzled, I went back into my own study. The next night, the whole matter came to a head. Sue Watkins came over, bringing some reference books, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and William Durant's Caesar and Christ. Sue had a friend with her, a young woman that we'd met a few times before. Our voices carried to Rob's studio. I knew, so I expected him to come and join us, particularly since Sue had made a special trip over here to give him the books. But Rob worked for more than an hour on his notes before he finally coming into the living room. And then instead of greeting Sue and her friend, Tim, as he usually would, he turned to the books instead and leafed through them impatiently. He'd read a few passages and then he'd stare haughtily at Sue or at me and say, "See, they don't know. The so-called experts contradict themselves constantly." And he kept this up, reading a few passages and then remarking in this way for nearly an hour. I kept staring at him. Rob, of all people, practically pinning Sue and Tim to the couch while he force-read them portions of religious history. I couldn't get over it. I'd never seen Rob act that way before. Usually, he's a most considerate host, but whenever anyone tried to change the conversation, he'd just look up rather coldly and then continue his reading and comments. He caught Sue's eye, and she looked over and shrugged comically. "Hun, why don't you tell us about the records and straighten out all those wrong dates?" I laughed, thinking that my joking question would snap Rob out of it. But instead he turned to me and he said seriously, "Don't you understand? I'm concerned because the stupidity involved. It's a simple enough thing to keep records." Sue and I broke out laughing. I tried to tell Rob how differently he was behaving than he usually did, but he couldn't see it. Not only that, but there wasn't a shred of humor in his attitude. Twice I started to say something and he cut me off rudely, and I felt confused and humiliated. I'm very good at picking up on Rob's feelings, though, and he simply wasn't angry at me. There was an anger I felt. Where was this anger that I felt coming from? I was upset at Rob. No. Let me read that again. Was I upset at Rob hiding it and then projecting it outward? No, I was sure it wasn't that. Yet Rob was displaying strong disapproval. And that disapproval somehow made me want to bait him. Finally, Sue and I both started asking Rob about the records again with mock seriousness. Just at this point, I suddenly saw a sharp, brilliant, mental image of a tall man in a long robe standing behind Rob's chair. He wore a pointed hat and he looked very formidable and disapproving indeed. His presence was unmistakable. Sue sat across the coffee table from me, facing Rob. Something made me glance over at her as soon as I saw the figure. Sue literally shrank back on her couch, her face bright red and her eyes wide open, staring. I hadn't said a word about what I was seeing. Involuntarily, I said, "Sue," meaning, "What's wrong?" "Why, I'm really afraid of Rob," suddenly. Intimidated is a better word. She kept staring at him, obviously astonished by her own reaction. "Really?" Rob spoke innocently. Rob spoke so innocently that I swore he didn't realize what was happening. But then I said, "Hun, I think you know more about those biblical records than you realize." And he answered in quite a normal voice, "Yes, I do." I didn't know why I had made that comment to begin with. And I still saw the man standing behind Rob's chair. I didn't want to mention this vision, hoping that others might become aware of the figure without any clues from me. I knew that the man in the robes was somehow connected both with Rob and the records. "Tell me what you know," I said to Rob, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "Or I'll ask questions if you want, and you try to answer them automatically." As I spoke, I felt that the figure behind Rob wanted to speak, and thought that Rob might find himself effortlessly expressing the other personality's ideas. Suddenly, I realized that Rob had been doing that all night. "All right," Rob said. Sue hadn't taken her eyes off his face. Her friend Tim hadn't said a word. "What do you know about the records of time?" I asked. "I kept them." Rob spoke quietly and evenly. "Is that why you're so upset?" "Yes, I was there." "Did you know Christ or Paul?" "No, but I heard of them. I kept records." "What was your name?" "Naz something. I can't get the rest." Sue was staring at Rob with the most intent expression, so I said to him, "Do you have anything to say to the girl on the couch?" Again, I didn't know why I asked that particular question either, except for Sue's intentness. Rob looked directly at Sue, and then he said, "You were quite a problem." He spoke quietly in his own voice, but there was an alien quality to it too. I barely had time to notice this, though, when he and Sue began speaking at once so quickly that the conversation was difficult to follow. They were both describing an identical scene, a school in Jerusalem, agreeing on everything from the building's construction to the seating arrangements of the students. She spoke much more emotionally than Rob, but the two of them interrupted each other frequently. Rob would mention some detail, and Sue would say impatiently, yes, of course, but do you remember?" And off they go again. And according to the conversation, Rob had been a teacher named Nabeen in the school that was run by Sue's parents at that time. I was surprised for several reasons. Rob's psychic experience till then had centered on his paintings and various kinds of internal or exteriorized visions that he used, images that he used for models. Outside of that and some out-of-body experiments, he'd more or less left the psychic experimentation up to me. I also knew that he was well aware of my ambiguous feelings toward reincarnational dramas in class. As Sue and Rob talked, I still sensed the man behind Rob's chair. Finally, he turned his attention to me. He wanted me to act as a psychic go-between, and now there was no doubt of his identity. This was Nabeen. Rob was going along with the experience, but it was obvious to me that he was also cautious and inhibiting some strong emotions out of consideration for Sue. This holding back angered Nabeen. I was having trouble trying to follow Sue and Rob's excited conversation, while at the same time Nabeen kept mentally communicating with me, wanting me to make his presence known. So I interrupted and I described the image of Nabeen. Then I stood up behind Rob's chair to show where the form was, and as soon as I did that, the invisible Nabeen yelled at me mentally. "Have him tell her about the clay tablet. Tell her what it meant. Tell her what it meant to the school," he said. He was obviously furious and now ready to speak through me. I held off and decided to relay the message instead. For one thing, Nabeen's attitude towards me didn't exactly win me over. He obviously considered me frivolous beneath his notice, and he couldn't understand how such a person could be so psychically gifted. I sensed his strongly disciplined character at once, but his perfectionist tendencies had been allowed to completely dominate his creativity. I didn't like him, and I refused to speak for him, though this took a good deal of effort on my part. My own voice sounded like a whisper compared to his mental voice shouting at me. But I said to Rob, "Tell her about the time she broke the clay tablet." Sue yelled out, "Oh!" before I finished speaking. Now all warmth vanished from Rob's voice. "You broke the tablet in half, deliberately." "And I ran home, and you told my father." Sue was near tears. At this point, Nabeen tried to get me to speak for him again, and again I refused. As I did, Sue looked up and caught her breath, and Rob suddenly turned towards me. "Jane's face is changing," Sue cried, and I did feel funny, taller, almost cold. Most of all, I felt as if my features were older. The chin was becoming very tight, and the lips tucked in and pinched. "Hun, are you all right?" Rob asked. I nodded, half angry, half amused, because through Rob's concern, Nabeen suddenly understood that Rob and I were man and wife. He backed off, scowling, as Rob held my hand for a moment, and my features cleared. Mentally, I told Nabeen what I thought of him. Still, I was struck by the mobility of his reactions and the fact that our present hadn't been known to him before. At least it didn't seem to be, because he was quite surprised to discover that Rob was married. In fact, Rob's concern for me took some of the wind out of Nabeen's sails, and I finally didn't sense his presence anymore. Rob, Sue, and I were all tired. We decided that we'd each write up our own notes of the night's activities and call it a night. In bed, as Rob was dropping off to sleep, he turned to me and he said drowsily, "My father was in that class too. I just saw him as a girl." Right after breakfast, next morning, the phone rang, and it was Sue. She spoke excitedly, but gradually I found out what had happened. She started to write her account of the Nabeen episode when suddenly automatic writing took over, and she was writing for the girl that she had been in Nabeen's class. Her name then was Shireen. The sheets of paper quickly filled up with Shireen's scrawling script. When the writing was finished and stopped, Sue went about her daily housework. She swept the floor. However, she was overwhelmed by a deep sense of sorrow. Appalled, she stood there until she realized that this was Shireen's grief over the death of her brother back in the past. "It's been some morning," she said, and she promised to bring the notes over to us that evening. It was a Friday, and we also expected our friends Peg and Bill Gallagher to visit. As it was, Sue arrived first that night. Blushing, she made a joke reference to a pie for the teacher and thumped down a homemade pie and a 6-pack of beer. A gesture to Nabeen, I thought. But Rob was still painting in the studio. Looking embarrassed, Sue handed me the notes, and I read them while we waited for Rob and the Gallaghers. There were several pages. I'm quoting a few paragraphs here. because the episode mentioned was so pertinent in the relationship between Nabeen and Shireen, and as I read, I felt Sue's scrutiny. The passage is directed to Nabeen. There was something you said in class one day, something that you really hollered at me about. You just let go and went up one side of me and the other because I wasn't bothering with my lessons or the stupid formula and rules, and you yelled about my being no better than the illiterate whores in Rome, and that's how it turned out. You said in front of all the other brats, and I grabbed those tablets in a fury, those tablets that you'd gotten the stuff for in Greece when you were there, and I smashed those tablets right against the wall as hard as I could. Smash, 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 right into the wall, and the pieces flew all over the room, and the noise was still ringing in that room when I was running and screaming down the aisle. I ran all the way home, and I went to my father. I was still screaming with fury, but he didn't sympathize with me at all. He punished me because I'd done something awful to you, and he respected and understood you. My father was a calm, firm man, and the two of you talked a lot. I hated you for a long time after that, but my father made me go back to that school, and I wouldn't look at you or listen or no matter what you said, but I knew by then that I'd ruined something very precious to you, and I was sorry, and I didn't like myself very much for it. But I was proud. Oh, God, was I proud. And I couldn't say anything to you after that. Actually, this entire quoted passage was written almost like one long sentence, separated here and there with an and the word smash, smash, smash were in capital letters and underlined, and fresh emotion rushed out of the written words and seemingly out of the paper itself. I was almost embarrassed to meet Sue's eyes. But as I was finishing reading the notes, the Gallaghers knocked on the door, and a moment later, Rob came out of the studio, and I handed the notes to him. The room must have been charged because the Gallaghers stopped in the middle of the room before sitting down, and Bill said, "What's going on?" "Nothing," Rob said, and immediately sat down and began to read the notes. I grinned uneasily, and I said something like, "Rob and Sue have this past life thing going." Sue just shrugged, and the Gallaghers and I began an innocuous conversation. In the meantime, in a motion as smooth and easy as that it almost escaped me, Sue slid from the couch and sat down on the floor. She rested her elbows on the long coffee table, and she looked steadily at Rob as he read. Instantly, I realized that her body language was important. She'd taken the same sort of position in relation to Rob as the one she described with Nabeen in the classroom. Rob went on reading. "Well," said Sue, with a touch of defiance. "I just finished it this minute," Rob said. The part I remember most is the description of your father. I see him in my mind so clearly that I could paint his portrait now. I don't recall yelling at you, though, as you say in these notes. And Sue was Sue Shireen or Shireen Sue. Rob had sounded more or less like himself, though he was obviously speaking to Shireen, but Sue seemed more like Shireen than Rob seemed like Nabeen. "You don't remember," she shouted out. "You only called me a whore in front of the entire class. It damn near haunted all my life. And you don't remember?" "If that's what I said, then I'm sorry. I mean it," Rob said. "But your father is far more vivid in my memory, if my memory is what you want to call it, than you are." I thought that Sue Shireen was going to cry, and Rob was blocking Nabeen. Quietly, stubbornly, but quite effectively. And as soon as Rob said he remembered Shireen's father better than he did her, then the Shireen in Sue began baiting the Nabeen in Rob, trying to draw him out. She was just daring him to show himself, while Rob, I knew, was just as determined to keep under control. Sue said, innocently enough, "It would be great, though, to find out more about those old records." "I'm willing enough," Rob said, but his voice was mild and non-committal. Sue scowled, and I realized that Shireen and Sue was demanding attention from Nabeen as she always used to, while Rob was reacting exactly like Nabeen and withholding it, though now for different reasons. I pointed this out to Rob, and when I did, he looked directly at Sue and he said, "I'm sorry, and you've changed a lot, but so have I." And then, with no transition, he went into the kitchen for more beer. He'd no sooner gone through the door when Sue yelled and pointed to the doorway. "It's him, Nabeen, three-dimensional." Bill Gallagher grabbed a pen and scribbled down her description of what she saw. Sue whispered to us, her eyes never leaving the doorway. Nabeen was solid, not ghostly, about 5'10". He wore a dark blue robe with huge sleeves, and apparently the same one that I saw him in mentally the night before. He was thin. His neck cords were sticking out. His nose was long, and his lower portion of his face sunken. His lips pursed in a clipped, tight smile. He looked about 45. Sue saw him for a few minutes, and then he disappeared. When Rob returned, the whole thing was over. Sue's description matched my mental image of Nabeen, though this time I hadn't seen anything. Neither had Peg nor Bill. Rob didn't seem a bit surprised either. The conversation returned to biblical times and the Dead Sea Scrolls, subjects about which I know little, and that night they just didn't interest me at all. So I just sat there listening, letting the words go over my head. My glance drifted over to Sue, who was still sitting on the floor. She wasn't taking part in the conversation either. Then I did a double take. This girl wasn't Sue. She had the same coloring and general features, but there the similarity ended. Peeking out through Sue's eyes, Shireen showed herself so blatantly that I caught my breath. She struck me at once as unusually alive, immediate, and vital, no matter who she was or what was happening. This personality showing through Sue was as responsive and agile as an animal. As I watched, Shireen took over Sue's features completely. The transformation was fascinating to watch. Shireen stared out with belligerent curiosity into the room, studying everything on the table in return. There was a strong sense of covert behavior, a sly delight in getting away with what she was doing, and a determination to take full advantage of the opportunity. Click, click, click. You could see her file away each bit of information for future use. To me, she seemed to be a greedy, grimy, mean little girl of about 12 or 13, shrewd, highly intelligent, loaded with energy, but unloved and furious at the world. I didn't dare draw any attention to her for fear she'd vanish. Rob and the Gallaghers went on with their animated conversation. They seemed lost in it. I sat there stunned, watching. My heart went out to the girl, though, and because of this, the real Shireen, not the little lady suggested in certain passages of Sue's notes, not included here, where she had a great merit on her parents' wealth and social position. This was a little slut of a girl, and one bright enough to know it. In the beginning, her slit, speculative eyes just went from object to object. What were those things? What were they used for? You could see the questioning. And then as I watched, the head lowered, the jaw jutted out, and in one swift sideways motion, Shireen stared boldly at Peg Gallagher. One full look, and then her head lowered again. This gesture was repeated with Bill, and then triumphantly with Rob. Again, I nearly gasped. This girl was alive, here and now. I remembered Joel speaking for Dave in class. How counterfeit, how one-dimensional Joel's performance seemed in contrast to Shireen's vital legitimacy. While I was thinking about this, Shireen stared at Rob again, this time involuntarily. I whispered his name. Rob stopped in mid-sentence and turned towards me. Shireen disappeared in a flash. I explained what had happened. The Gallaghers hadn't noticed anything. They'd been completely engrossed in the conversation. Rob had sensed Shireen's presence, though, and I think he purposely avoided the situation for Sue's sake. Sue had been aware of Shireen's feelings and reactions all the time. I could feel her peeking out at the world that was so strange to her, getting a first-hand look at Nabeen, or at who Nabeen is now. Sue grinned, and then she added, she couldn't get over the fact that Rob and I are friends, or that I wasn't in a subordinate position anymore. But I was staring uncomfortably at Rob, and suddenly, making some connection of my own, I knew Nabeen too, but in a different way. What about those times in our marriage when Rob seemed taken over by an uncharacteristic coldness, when an implacable insistence on perfection suddenly possessed him? These characteristics would rise now and then, seemingly from nowhere, and then vanish. And I always reacted to Rob then exactly as I did to Nabeen. What part had Nabeen played in our marriage? I said what I was thinking, and I wondered aloud what particular remarks of mine might trigger Nabeen-like responses from Rob. Before Rob could answer, Sue spoke up so quickly that one word fell over the other. Wait, I get it, she said. Each of us relate to certain aspects of ourselves and other people too. It's like solving problems all across the board. One incident in the present acting like a magnet to attract a personality, say, that lived 3 centuries back. For a moment, we were all quiet. We teetered on the edge of knowing. Peg Gallagher said slowly, like Nabeen and Shireen working out their old problems tonight, in our present. But in their present, too, I almost shouted, because I caught another glimpse of Shireen peeking out through Sue's eyes. Seldom have I seen pure emotion as honestly and clearly in anyone's face, reflecting so exquisitely the inner guises of being. What Shireen's newly born that night, was Shireen newly born that night, I wondered, brought to life in response to Nabeen, who was a personification of certain buried elements in Rob's being. Did Nabeen require Shireen and vice versa? Were the two personalities bringing themselves up to date with amazing rapidity, grabbing memories literally out of the air? Were we witnessing the birth of a personality, seeing an accelerated form of process that might really take place in front of us constantly, usually showing only in gradual change that we show through time? Or were we seeing two persons who died in our terms long ago, before any of us were born? If so, then death, where is thy sting? I thought, because I guarantee that Nabeen and Shireen are as alive as I am. I stared at Rob. He seemed so perfectly himself. Then where had Nabeen gone? Other selves flickered in and out of our glances. Other moods, once ours? Rising up the stairs, out of the molecules. Again, I caught the hint of some knowledge that could vastly illuminate our current concepts and shed new light upon our own behavior. But it would be another year before I understood that night's significance. The strong emotions that had charged the room were gone, but we were still riding some invisible psychological hills. Once Sue asked Rob about the records again. He looked up and he said in an absent-minded way, I was a cut above the ordinary citizen. I knew a lot about what was going on because of my work. It was about the year AD 30. Some of the records I left in the busy northwest section of Nazareth, Zabodi. He paused, blinking. I don't know why I said that or where that came from, but there are more records. I hid them outside Damascus in caves. She knows. And he pointed to Peg Gallagher. Peg was just staring at him. You do know, he said. Peg's eyes widened. Why, I'm seeing something, she said. A big tree on a hill. No, it's a flat-top plateau. It's sort of an orange color. I'm almost getting a name. Heragba, I said suddenly, separating the syllables. That's it, Peg said. And Sue was suddenly Shireen, and she turned to Bill Gallagher, and their throat muscles moving compulsively. You. The furiously uttered words were all she got out before Sue clamped down and came back to herself. What's the matter, Bill said. Was I there too? Did I rape you or something? He was joking, but his face was bright red, and he still was shocked by Shireen's vehemence. Sue was blushing. You were a soldier, at least that's what I'm getting. A dirty old man type. Bill didn't say a thing for the rest of the evening. Very shortly, he said that it was time to call it a night. Usually, he has a special word for Sue before he leaves, but that night he just walked past her as if she wasn't there. We'd eaten Sue's pie. I told her to wait while I washed up the dish. Instead, Rob took it into the kitchen, washed it up, and returned it to her. Returned it to Sue with a particularly gallant gesture. Nabeen, I thought, making amends. The night was over, but its implications rested in my mind, and the questions it presented hung unanswered. We weren't finished with Nabeen or Shireen, but I wouldn't be at all surprised if some of the concepts in aspect psychology weren't born that night. If so, then Nabeen and Shireen did us more service than we knew. And that's the end of Chapter 5. Chapter 6 is called Another Universe, A Flower from Nowhere. And a writing class goes psychic. All right, wow, very interesting. So I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And please like and subscribe. And till soon.